Here's to the old lady who still won't let go of Dad's money. My son Daniel slurred, raising his wine glass high enough for the entire restaurant to hear. The words floated above the white tablecloths and candlelight like an ugly cloud that didn't belong in a room meant for celebration. For a moment, no one moved. Silverware paused halfway to mouths. A waiter stopped beside the bar, and I sat there at the head of the table, 86 years old, wearing the pearl necklace my late husband Thomas had given me 40 years ago, holding my water glass as if nothing unusual had happened. The dinner had been meant to celebrate my birthday. 86 years is a long road, and I had thought perhaps this evening would be simple and peaceful. The restaurant overlooked the river that ran through our town, the same river Thomas and I used to walk beside on summer evenings when Daniel was still a little boy chasing ducks along the railing. I had reserved the private dining room weeks earlier. White roses sat in a low vase in the center of the table. The candles flickered gently, reflecting in the tall windows behind Daniel's chair. From the outside, it looked like a warm family gathering. My son, his wife, Linda, my grandson, Ethan, a few relatives, and two of Daniel's business friends who had insisted on joining the celebration. Everything had seemed pleasant enough when we first arrived. Daniel ordered an expensive bottle of red wine, then another. His laughter grew louder with every glass. I noticed the way Linda watched him carefully, not stopping him, just letting the evening drift where it wanted to go. I noticed the way Ethan kept glancing at me, as if he sensed something building under the surface. But I said nothing. At my age, you learn that silence often reveals more than questions ever will. Then Daniel stood up with his glass. At first, I thought he was going to say something kind. A birthday toast, perhaps. The room grew quiet in that polite way people do when someone begins to speak. And instead, he gave that toast. The old lady who won't let go of Dad's. He didn't even finish the sentence properly. A few people gave uncomfortable chuckles, the kind people offer when they aren't sure whether something is supposed to be a joke. Someone shifted in their chair. Ethan's face turned pale, and Daniel smiled as if he had said something clever. I slowly lifted my glass of water and took a sip. The water tasted cold and clean, and it steadied my hands. After 86 years, I've learned something about moments like this. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the power. Daniel thought his words embarrassed me. He thought he had exposed something about me in front of everyone at that table. But as I sat there under the soft glow of the candles, watching my son grin proudly at his own cruelty, I realized something very simple. My husband had been right about him all along. I kept my smile long enough for the room to recover its balance. Conversations slowly resumed, although they sounded thinner now, like music played from another room. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else reached for the breadbasket. Daniel sat back down heavily in his chair, clearly pleased with himself, and poured more wine into his glass until it nearly spilled over the rim. Linda leaned close to him and whispered something that made him laugh again, a low, careless laugh that echoed against the wood-paneled walls of the private dining room. I folded my hands gently in my lap and studied the white roses in the center of the table. Their petals were perfectly arranged, delicate and calm, untouched by the tension floating around us. I had chosen those flowers because they were Thomas's favorite. He used to bring them home every spring when the garden shop on Maple Street opened after winter. For a moment, I could almost see him standing beside the table the way he used to during family dinners, tall and quiet, watching everyone with that thoughtful look he always had when Daniel started talking too loudly. My husband rarely interrupted anyone, but he had a way of raising one eyebrow that was enough to quiet an entire room. I often wondered if Daniel ever noticed how much his father observed without speaking. People underestimate silence. They always have. The waiter returned to refill the water glasses and asked politely if everything was satisfactory. I thanked him and nodded, and the young man gave a small, uncertain smile before stepping away again. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. It was just another birthday dinner in a comfortable American restaurant overlooking the river, with a family sharing food and conversation. But beneath the calm surface, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. I glanced across the table at Ethan. My grandson was 23 years old now, tall like his grandfather and far more thoughtful than his father had ever been at that age. He was staring at his plate, turning his fork slowly between his fingers. When he noticed me looking at him, he gave a small apologetic smile, as if he felt responsible for a moment he had not created. I gave him a reassuring nod. There was no reason for the boy to feel ashamed for another man's words. Daniel, meanwhile, had already moved on to telling one of his loud business stories about a real estate deal outside Chicago, describing square footage and renovation costs, as though the evening were simply another dinner with clients. Listening to him, I felt the quiet certainty that had been growing in my chest since the moment he raised that glass. My husband had seen this version of Daniel years ago, long before I had been willing to admit it. I remembered a night nearly a decade earlier when Thomas and I sat together in the kitchen after Daniel had left our house following a heated conversation about money. The clock above the refrigerator had ticked steadily while Thomas stirred his tea and looked at the window over the sink. He had spoken slowly, the way he always did when choosing his words carefully. He told me that love and trust were not the same thing, and that sometimes a parent must protect the future even from their own child. At the time I had argued with him. I had insisted that Daniel would mature, that responsibility would come with time, that family always finds its way back to respect. Thomas had only nodded quietly and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Now, sitting in the soft candlelight with my son laughing loudly at the far end of the table, I finally understood what my husband had meant. I let the rest of the evening continue as if nothing unusual had happened. The plates were cleared, dessert arrived, and the candles on the small birthday cake flickered gently while a few relatives sang the traditional song in soft, uncertain voices. Daniel joined in halfway through with exaggerated enthusiasm, swaying slightly in his chair as though the celebration were perfectly normal. When the song ended, he leaned back again and raised his glass toward me with a lazy grin that suggested the entire evening belonged to him. I thanked everyone politely and blew out the candles while the room offered scattered applause. For a brief moment the lights reflected in the river outside the tall windows, and the scene looked almost peaceful. Yet inside my thoughts were turning slowly through memories that stretched much farther back than that dining room. I remembered the first time Thomas had mentioned the word responsibility in connection with our son. Daniel had been in his late 20s then, already confident and ambitious, already convinced that success meant owning everything in sight. One afternoon he had visited the house with a stack of investment brochures and an energetic speech about expanding his business. He had spoken for nearly an hour about opportunities and market growth and the advantages of transferring certain properties into his control. I had listened proudly at the time because every mother hopes her child will succeed. Thomas had listened differently. He sat quietly at the end of the kitchen table, his fingers folded around a coffee mug, asking only a few careful questions. After Daniel left, that day Thomas stood by the window watching the driveway long after the car had disappeared. I asked him what he was thinking, and he answered with a calm voice that still echoes in my mind tonight. He said that ambition can build a life, but it can also blind a man to what truly belongs to him. I argued with him, then just as I had many times before. I told him Daniel only needed guidance and patience. Thomas nodded the way he always did when he allowed time to prove a point rather than pressing it further. Years later, when his health began to fail, we spent long afternoons together in the quiet living room reviewing documents and discussing what should happen after he was gone. Those conversations were not dramatic or emotional. They were steady and thoughtful, like everything else Thomas did in life. He explained that protecting the future sometimes required decisions that others might misunderstand at first. I trusted him because he had never made choices lightly. Now as I sat in that restaurant watching Daniel finish yet another glass of wine and laugh loudly with his friends, I could see how clearly Thomas had understood our son. Daniel believed the evening had exposed my weakness. He believed his careless words had pushed me into silence. What he did not understand was that silence often carries patience within it, and patience has a way of revealing truths that loud voices cannot hide. I looked across the table at Ethan once more and saw the same quiet awareness in his eyes that his grandfather once carried. In that moment, I realized that the story unfolding around us had been set in motion long before this birthday dinner ever began. After dessert, the conversation slowly drifted toward the familiar topics families use when they do not wish to look too closely at what has just happened. One relative began talking about the weather along the coast. Another mentioned a football game that had filled the stadium the previous weekend. Daniel continued speaking loudly about property values and renovation costs, as though the dining room were a conference table instead of a birthday celebration. I listened quietly while the waiter poured coffee into small porcelain cups and the candles burned lower beside the white roses. At 86 years old, you begin to understand that people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe no one is truly watching. Daniel believed the evening had ended in his favor. He believed his words had landed exactly where he wanted them to land. Yet I had not forgotten the last conversation Thomas and I shared about our son during the final months of his life. It was early autumn then, and the maple trees outside our house had begun to turn a deep shade of red. Thomas had been sitting in his favorite chair by the window with a blanket across his knees and a folder resting on the small table beside him. Inside that folder were papers that represented the work of an entire lifetime. Property deeds, business agreements, investments carefully managed over 40 years. I remember asking him whether he felt comfortable leaving everything in order before the end of the year. He looked at me with that same steady calm that had guided every decision he ever made. He told me that order was not simply about paperwork. It was about making sure the right people carried responsibility into the future. I asked him directly whether he trusted Daniel to handle the estate if something happened to him. Thomas did not answer right away. Instead, he looked out through the window at the quiet street and watched a neighbor walk his dog along the sidewalk. Finally, he turned back toward me and said something I did not fully understand at the time. He said that inheritance is not only about what a person receives. It is about what a person has proven they are able to protect. At the time, I wanted to defend our son the way mothers always do. I told him Daniel only needed more time to mature. I said that ambition often looks rough before it becomes wisdom. Thomas listened patiently and reached for my hand the way he always did when a conversation grew serious. He told me that love for a child does not disappear simply because we recognize their flaws. But he also reminded me that responsibility for the future sometimes requires quiet preparation. Those words returned to me now as I sat in the restaurant watching Daniel lean back in his chair with careless confidence. He spoke loudly about plans and opportunities as if the entire world already belonged to him. Linda nodded beside him with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Across the table, Ethan remained silent, his thoughtful gaze moving between his father and me. In that moment, I realized the evening had not been defined by Daniel's careless toast at all. The evening had simply confirmed what Thomas had already seen years before, and what I was finally ready to acknowledge with complete clarity. The evening eventually reached that quiet moment when restaurants begin to dim their lights slightly, and the staff moves more slowly between tables. Coffee cups were nearly empty, and the small birthday cake had been reduced to a few remaining slices on a porcelain plate. Outside the tall windows, the river reflected the yellow streetlights that lined the opposite bank, and the town looked peaceful in a way that often makes people believe nothing serious is happening inside the buildings along its streets. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believes he has just delivered the most memorable moment of the evening. He tapped his fork lightly against his glass, as if considering another joke. But instead he turned the conversation toward practical matters that sounded suspiciously familiar. He began talking about property maintenance, taxes, and the difficulty of managing a large estate alone. His voice carried easily across the table, confident and persuasive in the way he had learned during years of business negotiations. Linda nodded beside him and added a few quiet comments about how complicated finances can become for someone in their later years. The words were polite, but their direction was clear enough. I had heard variations of this conversation many times over the past 2 years. Ever since Thomas passed away, Daniel had grown increasingly interested in discussing what he liked to call long-term planning. He would mention how demanding it must be for a woman my age to manage investments and property records. He would offer to simplify things by placing everything under his supervision. At first I had responded the way many mothers do, assuming that concern was the same as care. But over time I began to notice how every discussion returned to the same quiet destination: control. Daniel believed the future of our family should move through his hands. As he continued speaking that night, I rested my fingers lightly against the edge of the table and listened with the same calm attention Thomas once showed when Daniel was younger. I noticed how confidently my son spoke about responsibilities he had never actually carried. I noticed how Linda watched the room carefully, measuring each reaction. And I noticed how Ethan remained silent, his eyes thoughtful, as if he were observing something larger than the conversation itself. The young man reminded me so strongly of his grandfather in that moment that it almost made me smile. Finally, Daniel turned directly toward me with the friendly tone he used whenever he believed persuasion would finish what pressure had started. He said that perhaps it would be wise for us to schedule a meeting soon to review the estate documents together. He suggested that transferring certain responsibilities to him would make life easier for everyone involved. His words were smooth and reasonable, the kind that sound responsible to anyone who has not listened carefully to the same request repeated for years. I took a small sip of my coffee and set the cup back onto the saucer with deliberate calm. At 86 years old, there are very few conversations that truly surprise me anymore. What surprises people instead is how patience can quietly reshape a situation long before anyone notices. Daniel believed the evening had moved exactly where he intended it to go. But as I looked across the candlelit table and saw the certainty in his expression, I realized that my husband had prepared for this moment long before my son ever decided to raise that glass. I listened to Daniel finish his explanation about responsibility and planning while the last candles on the table burned down to small glowing pools of wax. He spoke with the relaxed certainty of a man who believed he had already won an argument that had not yet truly begun. When he finished, he leaned back again and folded his hands behind his head, smiling at me as if he expected gratitude for his concern. The others at the table watched quietly. Linda studied her coffee cup. One of Daniel's friends adjusted his napkin and avoided looking in my direction. Ethan sat very still, his eyes moving slowly between his father and me with the careful attention of someone who understood that the evening had shifted into unfamiliar territory. I placed both hands gently on the tablecloth and spoke in the calm voice Thomas always admired. I told Daniel that he was right about one thing. Managing an estate requires careful thought, patience, and a clear understanding of what a person is protecting. My son nodded eagerly, mistaking agreement for surrender. I continued speaking slowly so that every word settled into the quiet room. I explained that Thomas and I had spent many long evenings discussing exactly how the future should be handled after his passing. We had reviewed every document together, every investment, every property line and bank statement. I told Daniel that his father believed strongly in preparation. That belief had guided every decision Thomas made in business and in family life. Daniel's smile remained in place, but I noticed a small crease appear between his eyebrows as he tried to follow where my words were leading. I went on to explain that Thomas had asked our attorney to update several documents during the final year of his life. He wanted to make sure that the responsibilities connected to our family estate would only be carried by someone who understood the difference between ownership and stewardship. The room grew noticeably quieter as I spoke. The waiter approached our table for a moment, sensed the tension, and quietly turned away again without interrupting. Daniel lowered his hands from behind his head and leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from confidence to curiosity. Linda watched him closely but said nothing. Ethan looked at me with an expression that reminded me once again of Thomas. There was patience in that young man's face, and a calm intelligence that seemed to understand that some truths take time to arrive. I finished my coffee and placed the cup back on the saucer before continuing. I told Daniel that the documents his father prepared were very clear about how decisions concerning the estate would be handled. Those decisions were not designed to move quickly or easily into anyone's hands. They were designed to protect the future of the family in a way that required trust, responsibility, and careful judgment over time. Daniel opened his mouth as if preparing to respond, but no words came immediately. For the first time that evening, the certainty in his expression had begun to soften. And as I watched that change appear across my son's face, I realized that the quiet preparations Thomas had made years ago were finally beginning to speak for themselves. I watched Daniel closely as the meaning of my words began to settle across the table like a slow-moving shadow. The confidence he had carried all evening did not disappear instantly, but it shifted into something more cautious. He straightened in his chair and glanced toward Linda, as if searching for reassurance that the conversation was still moving in the direction he expected. Linda gave him a tight smile and reached for her water glass, but she did not speak. For the first time since we had arrived at the restaurant, Daniel looked uncertain. He cleared his throat and tried to laugh lightly, the same way people do when they believe a joke might restore control of a conversation. He said that, of course, he understood the importance of preparation and responsibility. He reminded me that he had years of experience managing business assets and property developments. According to him, overseeing the family estate would simply be a natural extension of the work he already did every day. His tone was polite, but I could hear the impatience beneath it. Daniel had always believed that persistence eventually forced every door to open. I folded my hands again and listened until he finished speaking. Then I explained something that Thomas had insisted upon during those long evenings when we reviewed the future together. My husband believed that wealth should never move faster than wisdom. He had seen too many families lose both when inheritance arrived before character was ready to carry it. Because of that belief, he had structured the estate so that no single person could simply step forward and claim authority over everything we had built. Instead, the responsibility was divided carefully, requiring time, accountability, and the approval of people who understood Thomas's intentions. Daniel's expression tightened as he listened. The certainty in his posture faded little by little while he tried to understand what I was describing. One of his friends shifted awkwardly in his seat, clearly aware that the conversation had moved far beyond a simple birthday dinner. Ethan continued watching quietly from across the table. There was no judgment in his expression, only a calm attentiveness that reminded me once again of his grandfather's steady presence. I continued speaking in the same measured voice. I told Daniel that the estate documents required multiple steps before any major decision could be made. Those steps included oversight from our family attorney, annual financial reviews, and a waiting period designed to ensure that whoever eventually carried responsibility had demonstrated patience and stability over time. My son stared at me as if the room had suddenly changed shape around him. The confident smile he wore earlier had disappeared completely now. He asked quietly why he had never heard about these arrangements before. I answered with complete honesty. Thomas believed that preparation did not need to be announced loudly. The people who truly understood responsibility would recognize it when the time came. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing at all. The candles on the table had nearly burned out, and the soft glow of the restaurant lights reflected across the river outside the windows. In that quiet moment, I realized something important. My husband had not simply prepared documents to protect our estate. He had created a structure that allowed time to reveal the character of the people who hoped to control it. And as I looked at my son sitting across the table that night, it became clear that Thomas had understood far more about the future than I had ever wanted to believe. I allowed the quiet to settle across the table before speaking again. By then the restaurant had grown nearly empty, and the distant clatter of dishes being washed in the kitchen carried softly through the hallway. The candles beside the white roses had burned down to small pools of light, and outside the windows the river moved slowly under the reflection of the street lamps. Daniel sat very still now, his earlier confidence replaced by a kind of restless calculation. He was trying to piece together the meaning of everything I had said, searching for the opening that would return the conversation to ground he understood. Linda leaned closer to him and whispered something under her breath, but her voice carried the thin edge of uncertainty rather than the calm assurance she had shown earlier in the evening. Ethan remained silent, watching the exchange with thoughtful patience. I finally continued speaking, not with the intention of arguing, but simply to explain what had been set in motion years before this dinner ever took place. I told Daniel that the documents his father prepared did more than protect property. They created a structure designed to observe how each member of the family handled time, responsibility, and respect. Certain assets were placed into a trust that could only be reviewed once each year. Major decisions required the agreement of our attorney as well as financial advisors who had worked with Thomas for decades. Most important of all, the trust required a demonstration of steady character before any authority could pass fully into the hands of the next generation. Daniel frowned slightly and asked what that demonstration was supposed to mean. His voice was no longer loud or confident. It carried the cautious tone of someone realizing that the ground beneath his expectations had shifted. I answered him honestly. Thomas believed that character reveals itself most clearly in moments when people think no one is paying attention. The way a person speaks to family members. The way they handle patience, respect, and gratitude. Those quiet moments often reveal more truth than any legal document ever could. As I finished speaking, I noticed Ethan glance briefly toward his father and then back at me. The young man seemed to understand the meaning behind those words far more quickly than Daniel did. My son sat there for several seconds without responding. He stared down at the tablecloth as if studying the pattern woven into the fabric, trying to understand how the conversation had moved so far away from the confident toast he had delivered earlier that night. Finally, he asked a simple question. He asked whether that meant he could not take control of the estate now. I shook my head gently and told him that responsibility was never something a person could simply take. It had to be earned over time. The answer settled across the table like the final note of a quiet song. Outside the window, a slow current moved along the dark surface of the river, reflecting the lights of the town we had lived in for more than 40 years. And in that quiet moment it became clear that the future Thomas had prepared so carefully was beginning to unfold exactly the way he had always intended. I remained seated for a moment after my words settled into the quiet room, letting the silence finish the conversation in a way that no argument ever could. Daniel stared at the table as though the polished wood might suddenly provide a different answer if he looked long enough. The confident posture he carried earlier that evening had faded into something smaller, something uncertain. Linda finally shifted in her chair and adjusted her purse, clearly realizing that the discussion had reached a place where persuasion would not change anything tonight. Ethan sat quietly across from me, his expression calm but thoughtful, the way Thomas used to look whenever a complicated moment revealed the truth about someone's character. I gently pushed my chair back from the table and rose to my feet. The waiter appeared almost immediately, offering a polite smile as he gathered the empty coffee cups and plates that remained from dessert. I thanked him and placed my napkin beside the small vase of white roses before turning back toward my family. Daniel finally looked up at me then, and the question in his eyes was no longer about control or property. It was about understanding how the evening had moved so far away from the confident story he had imagined earlier. I spoke calmly, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty that comes from many years of watching how life unfolds. I told him, that responsibility is not something that arrives through a toast or a conversation over dinner. It reveals itself slowly in the way people treat those around them, especially when they believe no one is keeping score. Thomas understood that better than anyone I have ever known. That is why he built the future the way he did. Daniel listened without interrupting. For the first time in a very long while, he seemed to recognize that the world does not always rearrange itself to match a person's expectations. Linda stood beside him now, her expression carefully neutral, as if she were trying to decide whether the evening had simply gone wrong or whether something much larger had shifted beneath them both. Ethan rose from his chair as well and walked around the table to help me with my coat. His gesture was quiet and natural, but it carried the same quiet respect that Thomas always showed the people around him. I thanked him softly and placed my hand on his shoulder for a moment. When I finally turned toward the door of the dining room, the river outside the windows was still moving steadily under the glow of the streetlights. Life in our town would continue tomorrow just as it always had, with people walking along the sidewalks and shops opening their doors along Maple Street. Behind me, Daniel remained standing beside the table, still trying to understand how the evening had revealed more about him than he ever intended to show. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I realized that the future Thomas had prepared was already beginning to take shape, not through arguments or sudden victories, but through the quiet patience that allows character to reveal itself over time.